Hi, this is the GIFTuber channel. I don't live stream, and I make video content about whatever I want to talk about. Good morning, good evening, and good night to you all. So, a little bit of stand-up for you. What do you get when you mix chainsaws with a man? One of my favorite manga series, Chainsaw Man. I didn't say it would be good stand-up, but you want to know what is good and stand-up? Who is this, you may ask? Well, he's the inspired, film-loving manga artist and writer with a very prestigious catalog of quality stories. Look Back, the touching story of two teenage manga artists, Goodbye Eri, the inspiring meditative story about a young filmmaker trying to win back the respect of his peers, and we can't forget his first serialized manga, Fire Punch, a superhero story of sorts, which features a Sweet Home Alabama of a plot point to rival Luke and Leia, cannibalism, and superpowers that make him eternally light on fire. And that was all in the first volume. Also, he made Chainsaw Man, and it's, it's really good, totally underground kind of little story, nobody knows about it yet. I mean, is there even an anime for this thing yet? Nah, probably not. So one of the things that I love about Chainsaw Man as a series is the art by TATSUKI Fujimoto. Ever since reading this popular manga and going down the Fuji rabbit hole, I found myself really loving his art style, and I really connected with it as an artist. The messy style, the use of stark black and white, and crazy hatching, it changed something in my art, and elements of his style leaked right into my own, mainly his use of the hatches to convey movement. Now, not all of his stylings made it into mine, but then again, when refining and or creating your own art style, you really find yourself using only bits and pieces of the things that you ingest as an artist. And with this idea in mind, I wanted to create this little series, Style Study. In this series on Doom Room Bebop, I want to break down just a few of the styles that I find myself inspired by, and give you a, little shoddily done, little rundown of what these artists do and what I like about them, and maybe help some of you out there understand the art a little better, and even highlight some aspects that could be translated into your own art. With that said, this is Style Study, Fujimoto edition. So to keep things straight in this video, I want to split things up into a few little sections. These are the main things I picked up on and noticed in my lovely little hour-long study session of Fujimoto's work. There's kind of two different Fujimotos at play within these manga, and I kind of want to, delve into the things that I feel like define Fujimoto's overall style. His use of sketchy line work, messy hatching and shading, motion, clothing, close and far away, and his facial features like mouths, hair, and eyes. Like a film director, musician, or just any artist in general, Fujimoto has habits and patterns in his style that make his drawings distinctly Fujimoto in nature. So Fujimoto's line work, I feel, is one of the first things I noticed. His lines can range from fairly straight and sharp in some spots, and actually pretty neat looking, but then have areas where they just overlap and feel a little off on some level. Like Fujimoto maybe messed up in a few little spots, but didn't really sweat it and just kept drawing. It's possible that maybe he draws fast and loose, so his lines just naturally are just going to be kind of off a little bit. I found myself really connecting with this, because I'll be honest, at one point I felt a tendency to want to have straight, nice lines, and would get a little frazzled if I messed something up. And while Fujimoto wasn't the first fast and loose artist that I've come across, his style did instill some relief in me a little bit, telling me, hey, if an industry professional has little quirks like this in his art, you can too, and don't worry about it. His style, in my eyes, straddles that line between being a bit messy, but at the same time, uniform. It's imperfect in a way that looks good, and it feels distinctly Fujimoto. And this leads perfectly into my next section. So this section you could almost call a part 2 to the previous one, but mostly because Fujimoto's hatching and shading shares that distinct Fujimoto sketchiness that you see in his line art. A type that, while looking really messy, somehow does everything it needs to portray the shadows and space in the scene. Much of this section pulls reference from one of his one-shot mangas, specifically Look Back, though these techniques could still be present in all of his other works as well. I sketched this one panel from Look Back, just the chin of one of the main characters. The lines are, on one hand, all over the place. They aren't just straight lines. They're allowed to kind of curve near the bottoms. They overlap in strange ways, and they get scraggly and darken the more shadowed places, all while still perfectly conveying the spaces. Fujimoto has the idea of shadows down, as well as how anatomy works and affects the lightness and darkness of the shadows. And like many artists, he knows the rules, but like a crazy genius, he knows how to skillfully break them just as well. Chicken scratch might not be the term necessarily to use for his hatching per se, but it does kind of take on an element of that to some degree, and while some might say, oh, it looks bad, it's too scratchy, it's too messy, Fujimoto has this way of making the messy work and do the job that more neat shadows can do as well, and thus, as stated before, knowing the rules and breaking them skillfully. A little tidbit I noticed while reading through Look Back is how some scenes have this tendency to determine how detailed or how frenetic the line work can be. In moments of tension, or when Fujimoto is putting emphasis on a moment, the hatching becomes more intense, and more detail is put into the artwork, while other moments are left to being a little bit less busy with the shading. Like intensity in music, the more instruments you throw in, the louder and more fleshed out the sound becomes, and in Fujimoto's art, the shading is used in much of a similar way. Motion of all things in Fujimoto's art is something I feel like has stuck with me the most. Second to the line work, I wanted to figure out how to make action and motion look more dynamic and not just, like someone just standing still in a pose. There's a flashback scene in Look Back that if you've read the one shot you'll recognize, but this whole section contains a ton of motion. And in this panel of a foot, we see elements again of Fujimoto having a few straight lines that look neater than the rest, mostly to form the shape of the foot as it moves, while the hatching lines form the rest of the foot and give it the appearance that we are seeing this in a paused frame of a kick. You can see the lines starting out straight and then curving up at the bottom again, like in some of the previous stuff we saw, with lines bunching up in the darker spaces of the leg. It's likely that Fujimoto drew this in pencil and then drew the neater lines first and formed the rest of the foot with the little messy lines just to kind of show that sense of motion and everything that you're seeing in the frame. It's panels like these in both Look Back and Chainsaw Man, and even to some extent in Goodbye Eri, with the panels mimicking camera movement, that stood out to me and made me realize how much less dynamic some of my art sort of looked in some way and capacity, and made me want to improve that aspect of my stuff in a more meaningful way. Now, while this section is labeled clothing, spoiler alert, I do think that there are things here principally that I think could be applied to many other things too, and not just clothing. I'll make a note of that when it comes up, but for now, clothing. And like the S-shaped curve in my spine, the lines are curving and going all over the place. The line work here is kinda haphazard in some places, going between looking like curvy Z's, or what looks like little river curves, or broken lines even. Another thing I find interesting about how Fujimoto visually depicts clothing is how distance affects how he draws things. This is one of those techniques that I said could be used in other things as well. When characters are in these far away shots, the details go down a little bit, while the background is noticeably a bit more detailed. I feel like this is done to make the character stand out a bit more against the background, so that the character doesn't disappear into the background. Then we have the inverse, when things are more close up. This is where we see the hatching come to work and work hard, as the lines are more detailed and define a lot more of the light and shadow in the images. Details go wild in some places, but in others, it's not quite as detailed. This can double as both an artistic choice as well as a bit of a time management thing. If you don't have to detail something, then don't. And save the details for the bigger panels, that way you can make them look the best that they can. This is also sort of a technique done to make sure that things don't get too busy in the panels. Sometimes over-detailing can be just as bad as under-detailing in some spots. If you can't get a sense of space in the image as well as where the character is, it can really hinder the way you perceive the art or even the panels or even read the story. And this is something I feel like Fujimoto doesn't have a problem with and I feel like has down on a really good level. And this is where we reach the final section of this, the facial features. This is a part of the video that I feel like can be split into little subsections. Mainly the eyes, the hair, and the mouths, as these are the features of character design that I feel like are distinctly Fujimoto. One of the things that I notice in Fujimoto's art and character design that I don't see often in other shonen manga is how he draws more realistic feeling hair. A lot of times I see hair being drawn in chunks or in these giant spikes. They're more shape-like than anything, while characters in a Fujimoto manga have hair that comes down in strands. You see each individual part and detail of a strand of hair. This is especially true in longer hair characters and how they're portrayed in the mangas, while with messier hair, they're decidedly more spriggy and clumped into lines that stick up and go every which way. There's more realism in how he draws the hair, and probably one of the more realistic aspects of Fujimoto's artwork, as it is something that is very, very stylized in nature. And then we have the eyes. This is probably the most sketchiest thing I feel like Fujimoto draws, with a little line over the top to indicate where the top of the lid is. The underlids are usually very chicken scratchy, in which Fujimoto uses his trademark, almost netty texture that he has for the bags under the eyes. It's probably the first thing I noticed when looking at his character's eyes, because you don't really see those parts of the eyes detailed like that, and you see it in just about every one of his characters. It gives this more tired and disheveled look with the whole grid texturing under the eyes. It's rough and imperfect, but in a lot of ways it's a moment of style and story coming hand in hand in a lot of ways. Now, one thing that I do notice that kind of differentiates Fujimoto's style in his one-shots over what he does in Chainsaw Man is kind of how he sketchily shades the pupils and eyes. The iris is shaded to look almost gray in some ways, while the pupils are just these thick black mess of lines. Heck, there's actually some places in the one-shots where there's almost no iris shading at all, and you just have just a straight-up black eye, which is what I would be giving myself if I forgot to mention the last part of this video, the mouths. This is the last facial feature that I want to highlight here. Fujimoto mouths are rather interesting, as it's probably the thing that I have the least notes on, but at the same time I find that it stands out in a really interesting way. Fujimoto brings a lot of the cracks and crevices in the mouth that are sometimes a little overlooked in more stylized art, using shading lines to detail these little bits of the mouth, as well as kind of shade things like the teeth and the tongue. It's funny, I see more of these things kind of detailed in more like art gallery things more than I do in some comics and manga. And even going as far as even specifically going after the cheek and the dimple details. It's little details like this that make me really appreciate Fujimoto's art. Even teeth feel like they're drawn in such a unconventional way to what you would see in more stylized art. They're more jagged, sharp, more willing to show things like canines on the characters, and maybe even make the mouths look almost borderline broken and uneven, not unlike real teeth in a lot of ways. And with that, we cue the ending segment. Well guys, I hope this little style study was as fun for you as it was for me. I did this video as less of a how to do Fujimoto, and I guess more as a showcase of things that I like in his artwork. Building a style from scratch is a really tough thing to do, and some don't always know where to begin with building their style up. Though in a lot of ways it comes from looking at tons of comics, tons of manga, and other artworks, and just finding the elements that you like and mashing them together with other elements that you like and creating something wholly original, something wholly you. If there's anything I want you to take away from this video and others, it would be an appreciation for Mr. Fujimoto's art and style. And they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, so if something in his art inspires you and you want to mesh that in with something of your own, then, you know, that's really cool. And I hope that inspiration takes you further in your artist journey. I love Chainsaw Man, Look Back, Goodbye Area, as well as some of his smaller one-shots, and they've made me think a bit more on my art, as well as inspire me to push my art further and further. And if you aren't familiar with Fujimoto as a writer and artist, I hope this is a good introduction to the man's style, and maybe gets you to pick up a bit of his manga. And maybe, just maybe, give you a little bit of that Fuji motivation. Alright guys, that's it for me. Subscribe if you want to stay tuned for what I got in the pipeline. I don't know when I'll post next, but if you like these sorts of videos, definitely stick around. The door is always open at the Doom Room Bebop. Take care guys.